Well, we just come up from the bottomland, and you know, all the historians and civil writers, they all complain about McClellan abandoning what was in fact a very strong position of Beaver Dams Creek, and not supporting Porter, not insisting that it was time to fight the enemy here to the death. And I have to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, if I had that attitude, and if I were in a trial court and I was responsible to persuade the jury to that point of view, well, I'd have to do it with McClellan on the witness stand, wouldn't I? And cross-examine him under oath. Cover with him his state of mind, his reasons, his analysis. And I'd attack him very aggressively, and it would go on for hours and hours in the courtroom. And yes, we could drive him to the wall with the logic of the historian's point of view, because Beaver Dam Creek was a physically strong defensive position, as is Boatswain's Creek, as you've seen here. But at the end of the day, however wilted McClellan might become in his personality and his bravado, I'm afraid that he would be able to slam me in the face with a fist by simply saying, "Mr. Ryan, I admit it. I admit these are strong positions. I admit they could be defended fiercely. But what is it that I've brought this army to Richmond to do? To fight for my railroad? To spend weeks and months here locked in mortal combat with General Lee in front of Beaver Dam Creek, much less Boatswain's Creek? Because I'm not going to be able to move forward toward Richmond. I'm not going to be able to capture Richmond. I'm going to be barely holding on to my railroad because I'm not being supported by my government." And when he says that, I'm afraid as a trial lawyer, I'm going to have to step back, and I have no comeback. What am I going to say to him that shows the jury he's wrong? You look through the record, ladies and gentlemen. You read the historians' books and the Civil War writers' books, and you come to the battlefields and you read the rebellion record, and you come into court and tell a jury the answer to that question that McClellan at the end of the day would throw in my face, and which frankly, after 30 years of trial practice and experience on these fields, I have no rock, no piece of evidence, no logic, no idea that I can reach out to and use to combat the rhetorical question McClellan asked me. So at the end of the day, because he was not properly supported by Lincoln, he felt it necessary to fall back to the James River and start over again. And so as far as he got to here, from Fort Monroe to here, I have to cut him the slack. I have to accept the fact that he was the man on the scene, and that as a soldier and general, he made an intelligent and calculated decision that makes a lot of sense when you realize his objective for being here was to capture Richmond, not defend his communications. Well, let's move on to Malvern Hill, where I have to tell you I'm going to part company with McClellan. And I'll have something to say to him about that issue in front of a jury that he can't rebut. Well, we reached Malvern Hill. We've been at this now for over 2 days. This is a semblance of location of McClellan's gun line, but McClellan had 120 guns. He had 120 pieces of artillery filling in these gaps almost hub to hub across this space in front of us here in several tiers, like the infantry tiers that we talked about at Boatswain's Creek. Here he had tiers of artillery, and these guns are all pointing in that direction toward that hill over there, and that depression, that saddle, and then this slight rise to here. General Lee has been pressing McClellan all the way from Richmond, which is about 15 miles away, and he's been trying to cut him off, and he's been struggling, General Lee, to break into the line of march of McClellan's columns, and McClellan has rear guard fighting, and he's been successful at it. And now he's got his whole army here behind us with all his artillery in front of us, and General Lee is just desperate to drive McClellan into the James River. That's his goal, and General Lee does not care, ladies and gentlemen, how many casualties, which puts him in exactly the same frame of mind as General Grant out west. These are two men that do not care about casualties. They are sacrificing thousands and thousands of men for a military advantage that they think it's necessary to achieve. And in this case, General Lee's objective is to get McClellan off this hill. And so we have waves of infantry charging up this hill, and they're being wiped out, incinerated by the fire of this artillery. And yet, at the end of the day, what does George McClellan do? Ladies and gentlemen, what does he do? He had me trapped. Remember that? He had me trapped. Back at Boatswain's Creek, we had him on the stand, and he was able to throw in my face the fact that he wasn't here to fight for that railroad, for his communications, for his line of supply, that he was here to capture Richmond, that he could not do both tasks, and that because he wasn't being supported by Lincoln, he had no choice under the circumstances, not being willing to risk his army being destroyed, to withdraw, retreat, find a new base, and that base is James River, which is just behind us here, a couple of miles. It would have been easy for McClellan to hold this position, which means that he'd only have 9 miles to go. He could go up the left bank of the James River and get back into a siege situation with Richmond from right here. But he retreats. He withdraws from, after having annihilated the Confederate effort to drive him off this hill. Horrendous casualties. He gives the hill up, and he withdraws his army another 7 miles behind us to Harrison's Landing, right on the James River. And then he digs in, and he's got this horseshoe arrangement from one side of the James to the other edge of the James, this horseshoe arrangement. And he's hunkered down with his back to the water with this fortification being built up around him. That's the situation at the end of the day that President Lincoln is confronted with. And now he's got no excuse in the courtroom. What possible excuse that the jury would buy as reasonable could George McClellan tell us about? Nothing. So I'm giving him up. I'm giving George up at this point, and I'm suggesting that if his conduct has fallen below the standard of military practice, the moment that conduct achieved that unfortunate level was here at Malvern Hill. Well, we've reached Harrison's Landing. It's been a long day. This is where McClellan brought his army to. He built up a vast network of fortifications in a horseshoe pattern. He had his army here directly on the James River. This is Tar Bay out here. If Jeremy would turn it around a little bit, Jeremy, you'll get a chance, ladies and gentlemen, to see that this bay would be filled with hundreds, literally, it's not an exaggeration, of vessels, steams, ships, barges, tugs, the whole thing, gunboats, from which he was now drawing his supplies. This is where he brought his army to. And of course there are these great historical stories about Lincoln coming down here to Westover. Westover itself is behind these gates that you see. Now Lincoln of course might have had an entirely different attitude about McClellan commanding the Army of Potomac any further if, when he got down here, Lincoln found McClellan at Malvern Hill, and that while this was his base of operations, McClellan would have wagons. He'd be wagoning forward the 9 miles that we've come from Malvern Hill to hold that position, and he would be holding it perhaps in front of the enemy. And that would have been an entirely different situation for Lincoln to deal with if McClellan was away from the river. But the psychology of this is pretty devastating. The fact that McClellan has retreated so far and has arrived here on the James. And McClellan is now telling Lincoln that his next idea is to cross the James River that's behind me. He wants to cross James River. He wants to approach Petersburg. He wants to lay siege to Petersburg, and in that way capture Richmond. Now this is obviously the idea that Grant ended up following through on 2 years later, but at this particular stage the idea of allowing McClellan to cross the river was just beyond Lincoln's ken. So when Lincoln left here on the steamer Ariel and we went down to the mouth of James River and back to Washington, he went with the idea that he was going to replace McClellan. And his first choice was Ambrose Burnside, who was handling an expeditionary force in North Carolina. And he had Burnside meet him in Hampton Road on board the Ariel, and at that time Lincoln tried to persuade Burnside to take over. Burnside, being a personal friend of McClellan, refused. And it's at that point that Lincoln began to look to the west, to these men from Illinois that were running the show out there. And this is John Pope was commanding the Army of Mississippi, and he had captured Island Number 10 on the Mississippi River. He had participated in the siege of Corinth and its capture, and Lincoln called him here with the idea that he would order McClellan to withdraw the army from this location, put it back on steam vessels, and send it back to Washington. This is 85,000 men now. They have to retrace their steps. And in the process of that movement back to Washington, Lincoln's plan is that all of those troops will end up in the possession of John Pope, and then John Pope will start a new operation against Richmond from the north. This results in General Lee, of course, as he waves goodbye to McClellan, quickly turning on John Pope. And Lee begins to march north to deal with John Pope. Well, this morning we crossed the Robinson River. We were basically following Stonewall Jackson as he approached Cedar Mountain, which you all know resulted in a battle with the advance of John Pope's army. And let me just set the stage of this map that we have here, which covers the tactical situation that these two armies found themselves in that led to the Battle of Cedar Mountain. The first thing to remember is that John Pope had come from the west at Lincoln's insistence, and he had been given command of a paper army that Lincoln called the Army of Virginia. And this is an army that is being drawn together from disparative elements. And these elements are separate corps. And their commanders have their own egos, and like human beings generally, their own jealousies. And the idea that this John Pope was going to come from the west and take overall command above them was not palatable. We had Franz Sigel, who had about 15,000 men. We have Irwin McDowell. Remember McDowell from the Peninsula and McClellan and his problems? He has 2 divisions, Rufus King and Ricketts. And we have Nathaniel Banks, who was a Massachusetts politician. He had serious difficulties with Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. He's got about 10,000 men. And these 3 elements, Sigel, McDowell, and Banks, total about 45,000 men. And they have been sent by John Pope to basically the area around Culpeper, which is off our map. Culpeper would be a little bit off our map. Pope sent Sigel on the road to Sperryville, which is a gap in the Blue Ridge Mountains. He sent Banks to Culpeper, and he had McDowell behind Banks. Nathaniel Banks takes a lot of criticism from the historians and the Civil War writers, but he was actually a pretty aggressive and courageous individual. Yes, he didn't do well in the valley on more than one occasion. Stonewall Jackson roughed him up, to say the least. But Banks wanted more. He wanted another round with Stonewall. He was not, afraid. So he ends up being the advance, because ultimately what John Pope is going to want to do is he wants to bring his whole army southward toward Orange Courthouse, down this road here that we see on the map, this red line, and he wants to get all the way down then to Gordonsville, where the Virginia Central Railroad crosses toward the east and then dips down to Richmond. He wants to get onto that railroad. At the same time this particular dynamic is occurring, you got to remember that we got McClellan's army is being withdrawn from the peninsula, and it's in the process of moving by ships up the Chesapeake Bay and into the Potomac and back to Washington. Lincoln's idea here is that he's going to, as these troops arrive in the upper Potomac and land, either at a place called Aquina Creek, which is next to Fredericksburg, or up to Alexandria, he's going to bring those troops west and give them to John Pope, so that John Pope's army is going to expand, and Pope will have command of the entire Union infantry that's here in the east, and McClellan will have no troops left to him at all. He's basically going to be sidelined. That's Lincoln's idea. So that dynamic is going on. And those troops have to be fed into Pope's army. And that just generates more disparative elements. It's like herding cats here for John Pope. And he hasn't done well with the historians either, but it's not appreciated.
how difficult it would be for a general to come from the west and walk into this situation and have to get control of all these personalities, bend them to his will. You know, you can issue an order, but those are just words on paper. You have to get it. You have to get it executed, and it's not going to be executed simply because you uttered the words. You're going to need the cooperation of the generals who have to move the troops. Now, General Lee, at the same time, you remember down in Richmond, as soon as he realizes that Lincoln is pulling McClellan out of the place, General Lee immediately starts turning his army northward, because his goal, his objective, from the time he begins to march is to get into western Pennsylvania, because he knows that the further north he can get, it will draw all the enemy away from Richmond that much further. So he sent Stonewall Jackson as his advance up the road from Richmond, from Gordonsville, crosses the Rapidan, which is shown here on the map, crosses the Rapidan. The Ewell's division, Richard Ewell's division, crosses the Rapidan at Liberty Mills and is moving in this direction. A.P. Hill is down on this road moving forward, and when they get up here to the Robinson River, we crossed the Robinson River not so long ago. When he gets up into this area here, he encounters Nathaniel Banks, who was moved down from Culpeper in this area. The two forces come together in this area near what's called Cedar Mountain. And a battle ensues in this area between General Lee's advance under the command of Stonewall Jackson and Pope's advance under the command of Nathaniel Banks. And a fierce battle occurs here. Pope sent instructions to Banks not to engage in a general battle, but Banks wanted to get another cut in here, and he attacks Jackson. And we'll go to the battlefield and take a quick look at it, the topography of the battlefield. But you can see here we have a mountain, we have this river, the Robinson River behind us, and we have this main road. Jackson barely holds his position. He does repulse the attacks. He does repulse the attacks that Banks creates. And Banks by this time is basically wrecked. I mean, his corps plays no appreciable part in any of the activities that occur hereafter. But at this point, John Pope decides to back up. He decides to retreat. He becomes concerned that if he remains at this position without the support of McClellan's army, which is still in transit on the Potomac, that he may be flanked, and he may be cut off from Washington, and he may be defeated. So, as a cautious individual, he makes an intelligent decision, and he backs up beyond Culpeper to the north bank of the Rappahannock River, which we're going to go to. And that permits General Lee to proceed up to the south bank of the Rappahannock. The last thing should be said here, it's sort of a prelude to the Battle of Antietam, and that's this business about the lost order, Special Order 191. If you've watched the other videos I've made, you know that my position is that the order was lost intentionally by General Lee. It was a ruse of war. It wasn't the first time that General Lee used that device, and another example is right here. Because what really induced Pope to retreat from this position after the Battle of Cedar Mountain was the fact that an order fell into his hands. A major named Fitzhugh on Jeb Stuart's staff wandered in the evening into a Union picket camp on the Rapidan River over here, the picket. And Fitzhugh claims that it was an accident. He thought that was Confederate. It was nighttime, and he just rode into the camp and was immediately facing rifles, and he was captured. And he had with him in a satchel some notes of General Stuart's that indicated General Lee intended to go across the Rapidan River this way, flanking Pope's position. And because of that note and that information, Pope backed up beyond the Rappahannock. And I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that that was a ruse, that Fitzhugh was sent with that order, with the intent that he'd be captured. He was a prisoner of war, and then after a few months he was exchanged. That's an example of how General Lee consistently at this particular time took advantage. Now, why would he do it, you would say? Well, why would he give forewarning to Pope of the menace that he apparently posed to the security of Pope's army? Why would he do that? Well, General Lee is marching north here with only about 35,000 men. Now remember, McClellan's got 85,000 men. John Pope has already got 50,000 men. And when those two forces come together, Pope's going to have over 100,000 men. And General Lee only has available to him about 35,000 healthy, hardcore young men who are marching with him. So he needs to conserve his energy. He isn't interested in fighting a series of battles. He certainly isn't interested in throwing away his energy on offensive operations when he has so little force. So if he can just get Pope to move back on his own, rather than trying to force him back, then he saved his energy for a later day. That's the value of the ruse in this particular instance. All right, we've taken the road horse now. We've crossed the Robinson River, and what we have Cedar Mountain in the background here. This is where the initial battle occurs, the first collision between General Lee's army, his advance guard under the command of Stonewall Jackson, and John Pope's army, his advance guard under the command of Nathaniel Banks. Now, after that battle occurred, General Lee rode to Clark Mountain, and I'll show you where that is. If you look over here, General Lee rode up to Clark Mountain, and there's a famous story about what he could see all the way to Culpeper. And we have behind Cedar Mountain, we have the line of the Blue Ridge that you can see through the haze. All right, we're going to go on now into Culpeper. That's where Pope had meant to concentrate his force, but once he realized, at least he assumed from the note that he captured from a courier, that General Lee meant to turn his flank, he moved back behind the Rappahannock. And that's what we're going to do. We'll go into Culpeper, we'll take a look at the town real quick, and then we'll go on to the fords. And there are several. You have Kelly's Ford, Freedman's Ford, White Sulphur Springs Ford, and then you have the Waterloo Bridge that leads into Warrenton. And over a period of weeks, these two armies, day by day, matched each other as General Lee moved up the river. And by the time they get up toward Waterloo Bridge, General Lee's got a decision to make.
Now once we get to Warrenton, Waterloo Bridge, we're going to follow the route that Stonewall took. Hold it, right here. We're going to follow the route that Stonewall took, and we're going to use that go-around principle that Jeremy Barbanel was telling us about. We're going to cross the Rappahannock at Hinson's Mill. We're going to go through Orleans, Plains, hit Thoroughfare Gap, and we're going to go about 20 miles into Pope's Rear, and we're going to just demolish his base of supply. Let's go do that. I'm walking down East Davis Street in Culpeper. 30 years ago, this street would be deserted. This was a poverty-stricken town 30 years ago, and all these buildings were vacant, and there was absolutely no place you could get something to eat except, you know, a bowl of soup somewhere in a coffee shop. So if you were out late, you were out of luck. And now it's turned into yuppie land. This is an incredible place. This is an outstanding restaurant. It's about time. Incredible restaurant. The fellow that owns that restaurant, he owns this market, which we're going to go into, and he's got a seafood restaurant over here. And all the people that come into this place to eat have moved in here from DC. So it says something about the prosperity of this country. And this is just outstanding stuff. This is amazing. This is like, you know, it's amazing. So if you're ever in Culpeper, you want to make sure you come in here and eat, because there's no better restaurant that I've been in the world. And I've been in some heavy restaurants in some major cities. I mean, there's everything here. Everything. Lobster. Look at this. Prime rib, New York strip steak, fresh fish. It's all here. I mean, you know, you could be in Manhattan and you'll not do better than this deal. So there's a lot of money that's come to Culpeper in the last few years. Well, we've met a gate on the right bank of the Rappahannock, so now we're going to go to the left bank of the Rappahannock and see if development has foiled our efforts. Now we're falling down into the river valley now. Very few of you will ever have an opportunity to be here, because this is all going to be ripped out, as scarified and developed with big mansions. Now, this is a pretty steep climb out here, but it's a wagon road. It's just a question of the strength of your horses and the weight of your wagon. So this is it's about what, 50, 60 feet, and then it's going to flatten out into the river basin. General Lee followed Stonewall. After Stonewall reached Manassas Junction and Pope turned to deal with him, he completely ignored Lee. He figured, you know, he was going to regain his base. That was number one. And then having done that, he would attempt to punish Jackson for the insult. And while he's trying to do that, General Lee is following the same route to join with him. And at this particular moment in time, the Battle of Second Manassas isn't in General Lee's mind. It's only a possibility. Whether or not he will have Jackson stand at the Bull Run battlefield or order Jackson to join him as he marches north towards Leesburg is still an open question in his mind at this point. It's an open question because General Lee doesn't know at this point where the rest of McClellan's army is, other than some of it has reached Pope and the rest of it is soon to reach him from the west. But precisely where these corps were at this particular moment, General Lee can't say. He won't know that until more hours pass. Now that's the right bank of the Rappahannock, the bluff climbing out, and that yellow house marks that road we were on trying to get down there from that side, but they have a gate now. Now you get your first view of the river crossing. And the reason this is physically there's evidence of Hinson's Mill is because of the race issue. The race that the mill uses to generate the water power. The column would have come down around the yellow house, loop down, slide down it, and then come back around. There are two granite boulders. That's one of them. The other one's over here. And from the drill markings on these boulders, it appears they were used as the base of bridge work. And this is the evidence of the mill. This little island here is the remnant of what it would have been used in part to form the race for the mill so that the water would run swiftly. I can't tell you that's the same house. If it is, I think it's been expanded. Certainly that red building wasn't here. Now this would be, I think, the bridge. You can wade through it. I mean, that's pretty simple because you just come out on the ground, but at the same time there are these marks. These are Tell me, Jeremiah. Jeremy.
Yes, Joe.
Tell me, what do you think? Have you had fun, or what do you think?
I've had fun. It's been an interesting trip. Fun trip.
What was the most important thing that you enjoyed? What was the thing that you enjoyed most, if anything, there, Jeremy, if you just rank them in some order?
Well, Benjamin Harrison's house is pretty interesting.
Boy, wasn't that?
It's a beautiful house.
That's an amazing house.
And I like that crater, the crater and the battlefield that it was a part of, Petersburg battlefield.
Yeah.
That was good. Oh, you know what? Actually tops Fort Monroe. Fort Monroe is at the top.
We've reached the end of our journey, people. This is the Manassas Gap Railroad. It's coming from Front Royal. We're in the Thoroughfare Gap of the Bull Run Mountains. We're on the line of Stonewall's March to Manassas Junction. This is the eastern end of the gap. The gap itself is about 4 or 6 miles in length. After a couple of days, General Lee is going to be following Stonewall down this same track.
Well, I gotta tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I made this map 30 years ago. And basically, it's a hand-drawn diagram of what we've been looking at, including Thoroughfare Gap and the March to Manassas. Now, you know, this place has been my playground for 30 years. It's where I've come with my pals to play. And it's just a great place, Virginia, to do that in. At least it was in my day, but as I've perhaps editorialized on more than one occasion, as you come through to these places, the old natural way the land was, access to the sites, some of which are on private property, but still this property is in the middle of nowhere. It's a wilderness, ready to be developed, ready for those big earth movers to come in and scarify the land and turn it into a Levittown. So you guys may not have the same opportunity I had, but it's still worth the venture, it's worth the journey. It's not so much the battlefields that count, it's the getting there. So I'm going to leave General Lee here. You all know what happens next, and I'm going to go off to Loudoun County and find myself a new cabin to hang out in for a couple of days.
This old house is falling down around my ears.
Blue Ridge.